I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. Every episode is written and produced by me, completely DIY. And what's more is that I record it in one single, flawless take. Just like the Scandinavian bards known as SKALDs would have. This is the final episode of the show's 5th cycle, but don't be intimidated. You should feel free to dive in right here, especially seeing as it's the best episode to date. Once you're done, once you've been sucked into the world of this ongoing story, you can go back and catch up on what you've missed by listening to previous episodes of the podcast or picking up the prose volumes available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 80. The centaurs approached. After a night of carousing, of singing, of drinking, of laughing, of warming their human hands by the fires that had taken Ravenna, of dancing upon their equine hooves, pounding what little remained of their conquest down into the ground, grinding it to dust, after a night that had given succor not through rest, but through celebration, the centaurs were once again on the move. They rose early. Though few had actually slept, their celebrations had left them sprawled out amidst the ruins of Ravenna, of the now crumbling arrondissements through which they had stampeded. And when they rose from the ground, when they lifted their massive bulk from the earth, lifted it up upon thick, muscular legs, they left behind green. Breaking up through the shattered stones, nurtured with dust, with ash, and with blood, green had returned to that massive, convulsing, beige city. Nature, though it had been battered into submission, though it had been imprisoned and confined to small, shameful parks, though it had been buried under civilization and progress, those twin goals of the cruel, unimaginative, and humorless, though the wilderness, the true wilderness, had been all but stamped out of Ravenna, now it returned. Where the centaurs had lain, the earth was now covered in grasses, in mosses, in weeds, but not weeds. Because what is a weed but a plant that isn't in keeping with the designs of man? No, there are no weeds but one, but the only species that devours and destroys everything in its sight, that serves no purpose but to consume, that if given free rein would eat itself to death, or perhaps more likely would decimate the very thing that gives it sustenance. No, those wild grasses, those homely flowers, those creeping vines, they were not weeds. The centaurs, they knew the truth. There was only one weed to be found within that border realm, and its name was man. But now, man's time, at least there, in that convulsing city, it was coming to an end. The centaur's campaign had been successful. unbelievably successful. They had cut through Ravenna's defenses easily, simply, joyously, and every time they clashed, every time Ravenna lost brave, misguided men and women in its defense, every time the most outer of those still standing walls, the best maintained of the still standing walls, every time they fell, it became easier for the centaurs to continue their push, and easier for the people of Ravenna to do that which they should have done from the beginning. Run. The centaurs rose. They stretched limbs both human and equine. They spoke of the fun they had had both the night and the day previous. They spoke of Ravenna's corruption, of the scars that humanity had placed upon the land, and when they did so, they had no choice but to spit and scowl in disapproval. They picked up their long, heavy staffs, the ones that doubled as bows and as clubs. They bickered over which belonged to whom, and then laughed because in the end, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered to them except that which they could see happening beneath their hooves, the return of the green, of the wilderness, of nature to the land that had been unjustly seized by Ravenna. And now, amidst those smoldering ruins, amidst those crumbling buildings, those shattered streets, the centaurs, the conquerors, the liberators, they capered and they galloped, relishing the feel of new grass brushing against their legs. But it was not yet time for rejoicing. Not yet time for full rejoicing, for the exuberance that comes with the utter defeat of your enemies comes from the unconditional surrender and your unquestionable victory. No, there was still work to be done, as evidenced by the drums that began to fill the air. The centaurs, they had no written language. Their culture, as it were, was passed down orally, through stories, through parables, through fables, through jokes, and, most importantly, through song. And as such, their army, their undeniable horde, they did not need missives from generals. They did not need emissaries darting back and forth from the front. They did not need fine parchment sealed with wax. They needed none of it, because they had their drums. And those drums, they spoke to something primal within the centaurs, spoke to something at the core of their being, the thing that both animated and defined them, that made them, even more than their equine bodies, made them something beyond mere humanity, something better. That primal beat stoked the flames within them. That irresistible rhythm stirred them, igniting their passions and urging them onward. If they had been a human army, you would be right to expect disappointment, to expect exhaustion, reluctance, possibly even outright desertion. After all, the centaurs' campaign had been ongoing. Their march upon Ravenna, upon that sprawling city-state, had been going on for ages. To some of that short-lived race, it felt as if it had always been occurring. Centaurs had been born upon that constantly moving battlefield, had been nursed at the back of the line, had been made strong by their mother's milk, and then had been sent to the front to join the stampede. But this was not an army of men. It wasn't an army at all. It was a horde, a terrible, bloodthirsty mass that didn't fight because they were told to. They fought because they wanted to, because they felt, because they knew that they must. So, as joyously as they had celebrated the night before, as happily as they had trotted amongst the new growth that had overtaken Ravenna's ruins, the centaurs took up their weapons. They fell in line, side by side, a wall of quivering, lathered horseflesh. And they marched forward. They had crushed the outer arrondissements. They had toppled their buildings, had set the rubble aflame, and had reclined in the ashes as the grass grew up around them. They had pushed Ravenna back. They had battered that once great city-state into submission. They had frightened the populace, those walking weeds, those humans. They had chased them back from their colonies, from their outposts, from their farms and their suburbs. They had galloped behind them, laughing as the humans scrambled to get to safety. Time and time again, they had toppled the walls. They had stormed into an outer arrondissement. They had reduced it to rubble, and they had stood back up and charged into the next. They bullied their way into a neighborhood that had once been protected, that had been buffered from the coursing wilderness beyond. They shattered it from its foundations upward, and they began the cycle again. Again and again, they had plowed through Ravenna. They had contracted its borders. They had toppled arrondissement after arrondissement like dominoes. And now, because of their vigilance, because of their charge, because of their stampede, Ravenna was smaller than it had been in generations. It was smaller than Ravenna had been since the Great Expansion, since Henno had stoked the fires of industry and of his ego, using the rest of that border realm as fuel. And now the centaurs found themselves at a wall, a monumental wall, a wall like no other that they had yet encountered. Ravenna, arrogant and complacent in its superiority and its strength, it had let its interior walls fall into disrepair, walls that had only ever been intended as temporary, only meant to stand until the city could expand beyond them. And as such, the walls that the centaurs had stormed through, the ones that they had sent tumbling down with the undeniable force of their stampede, they had hardly been obstacles at all. But this wall was different. It predated the memory of anyone living within that border realm. It predated the coming of the twins, Henno and Patro. It predated even the sundering of the worlds, the one that left the border realm stranded in the abyss, warmed by its dual suns. It was the true wall of Ravenna, and it sat along the city's true borders, its real borders, its original borders, the borders that had been established and maintained for millennia, existing in a taut but peaceful balance with the wilderness beyond. The walls stood high and proud. They were bigger than any that the centaurs had destroyed, bigger than they had ever seen, and they guarded the center, the hard, spinning core of Ravenna. The centaurs approached from the west. They made their way to the walls, and they looked up, shielding their eyes from the glare of the border realm's dual suns. They stared up at that never-ending expanse of stone, the one said to have been bewitched thrice over by Henno, by Patro, and most recently by the witch herself, Caleria. And as they gazed up, their sight dazzled by the suns, their senses dazzled by the enormity of the wall that loomed before them, their drums began to pick up speed. They adopted a frantic pace, one driven by necessity, by an unspeakable desire to put the world right, to return it to its natural state. The pounding, pulsing rhythms filled the air around them and traveled through the ground beneath them. The centaurs, speechless, they began to feel something grow within them, something terrible and yet welcome, something that they had experienced before, but never like this, never to this degree, never to this magnitude. The drums grew louder and louder, faster and faster, and slowly, steadily, all up and down the line. The centaur's hooves and staffs began to pound the earth in time, in that speeding, staccato rhythm. And those closest, the centaurs nearest the wall, they reached out with their human hands, with the staffs they clutched, and they also joined in, pounding upon the wall in an ecstatic fervor, one that caused their eyes to glow green and their mouths to foam. And if they hadn't been completely taken by their frenzy, if they hadn't already given themselves over to the stampede, they might have looked up to see that the wall that confronted them, that massive, impregnable barrier, it had begun to shake. Ho's entire world, his entire existence, was pain. Agonizing, excruciating, bottomless, never-ending pain. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to think. And when he managed to pry his eyes open, feeling the dried blood crack and crumble with the motion, it even hurt to see. Pink smoke stung his eyes. The pink light hurt his brain. And what he saw within it, what he saw sitting, waiting, grinning in that horrible room, it made his soul tremble and ache. Ho was bound, his wrists tied together, his arms bound to his sides. Even his ankles were tied. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep him grounded, to keep him stationary. He tried to stand, though his entire body cried out, begging him to stop, begging him to just lay down and die. He tried to stand. At which point he found that his wrists weren't just tied together. They were also lashed to a ring on the wall behind him. Ho was trapped. Ho was a captive audience. He was there for a reason. He was there to watch, a fact that came into focus as his vision did the same, and he found himself once again looking out at his former student, at Mouse, at that loathsome vermin prince. Good. You're awake. The look on the man's face was one of relief, of excitement, of a joy that was incongruous with its dire surroundings. Because on all sides, the vermin prince was flanked, was surrounded by, was all but consumed by degradation. Most prominent was the altar, that filthy, corrupted altar, a mockery of the divine, a slap in the face to all that was holy, to all that was truly holy, not just covered in filth, in garbage, in refuse, but comprised of it, built out of what Ravana had discarded. It was lopsided and uneven. It was precarious and poorly constructed. It was cloaked in a sinister aspect and in a state of progressive decay, as pieces were shaken off of it by the rumbling that had begun to shake the room, a rhythmic pulsing as primal as it was terrifying. You're just in time to watch, to experience, to savor it, to take it all in, to partake of the summoning. The Vermin Prince's face gave way to a beatific smile. To the summoning of my destroyer. Ho tried to speak, but he was unable to. Either from the beating he had sustained, from the damage done to his vocal cords, from the nauseating pink smoke that filled his lungs, or perhaps just from simple, craven fear. Whatever it was, he lay there helpless, silent, as the Vermin Prince lowered himself to the ground, placing his broken, crippled, skinny body in the center of that terrible, glowing sigil. The Vermin Prince threw his arms wide, and as he did, the cloak that surrounded him, that filthy, luxurious pink cloak, it disintegrated. It dispersed into the air, filling the room with ever more of the heavy pink smoke that still poured from the thuribles, the ones that shook and trembled with the rumbling, with the pounding that Ho could feel in the very rock that he laid upon. Suddenly, Ho realized that he and the Vermin Prince, they were not alone in that altar room, in that temple draped in filth, consecrated to desecration. He watched as she crossed the floor, as she looked back and down at Ho, as she winked and shot him a vicious smile before turning back to Master Ho's former student. It was the High Elf ambassador, that cruel, calculating emissary, Harana. She whispered something in the Vermin Prince's ear, a phrase that Ho could not parse, could not understand, but one that nonetheless pulsed with eldritch power. It was an encouragement. It was a blessing. It was an urging forward that the Vermin Prince had no intention of denying. And as she spoke, Ho watched her extend her hands, watched her take the Vermin Prince's thin, trembling fingers into her own, watched her open them up and place something hidden within them. No sooner had Harana bestowed upon the Vermin Prince that mysterious gift, that otherworldly focus, than he clutched it to his chest, that sunken, bony chest, now laid bare as the rest of him, as he sat naked in the sigil, as he began to chant in a language that Ho was horrified, was terrified to realize that he understood. Harana backed away quickly, with an expression in her eyes that to Ho looked very much like fear. And this was no surprise. It was no great surprise at all, as there was much there to fear. There was so very much to fear as the vermin prince reached out, as he called out to places that men should not go, to forces that men should not know, to a destroyer that had been rightfully banished, rightfully sent into the outer darkness, into that roiling underneath. Ho could understand the language, could understand that ancient, primal tongue, one that he had struggled to forget, struggled to leave behind, struggled to leave where it belonged. And he hated it. He hated that the words made sense to him, that their meaning rang clear, that he knew exactly what was coming, exactly what kind of doom that the vermin prince would bring down upon their heads. So he did his best to drown it out, to think of anything else, to ignore the unmistakable meaning that stared him directly in the face. And his host struggled with his knowledge of what was yet to come, struggled with his fear of what was yet to come, of the destroyer that was being called forth. The vermin prince continued his chant. He chanted in a rhythm syncopated with that of the rumbling, of the pounding that shook the very earth. And as that heavy bass rose, as it grew louder and louder, so too did the vermin prince's voice, that shrieking treble, the one that cut through the noise and the darkness, the smoke and the fear, the one that echoed off the walls and set Ho trying to force his frozen throat to speak. The vermin prince continued. His chants intensified, and they were soon joined by other voices, hidden voices, profane voices, voices from the outer darkness, from the roiling underneath, voices long dead and gone, long discarded and long cast out, voices that spoke sweetly to the vermin prince, that aligned themselves with his goals, with his desires, but truly what they wanted, what they truly wanted, was something far simpler, far darker, far more destructive. But the vermin prince didn't care. The vermin prince knew what he wanted. He could feel its presence, could feel that electric hate and resentment coursing through him, could feel the hairs on his arms stand up as that primeval force searched for a corporeal form. The vermin prince howled, and the voices laughed as that skinny, broken ruler cast his head back and he shook, taken by an unnatural, spectral epilepsy, one that sent him sprawling and spasming out amidst that glowing sigil. And as he did, as his body squirmed and writhed upon the floor, as his suffering poured out upon it, the true spell, the real spell was cast. Ho, finding his voice, cried out, not in speech, but in pure, desperate agony, in impotent fear. He let out a guttural, animal cry, one that was not heeded, that could not even be heard over the roaring of the sigil as those eldritch markings burst into a hungry pink flame. The vermin prince's howling continued. The unseen voices continued chanting, and they were joined by laughter, by a triumphant cackling that came from behind, that could have come from none other than that high elf ambassador, Harana. And through it all, Ho cried. He wept, his tears stinging the open wounds on his face as he stared helplessly into the flames. But not just into the flames. Ho squinted and he struggled to see through the flames, to see what lay beyond the flames, to set his gaze upon that terrible, ominous altar, the one that loomed over that flaming sigil, that looked down upon the shaking, drooling body of the vermin prince. And when he did, he saw something. He saw movement. He saw a shaking, spasming movement, a twisting, turning, agonized movement that came from beneath or perhaps from within that altar, the one that began to shed its skin, to slough off the filth that it had acquired, the refuse that had been heaped upon it. The flames rose, obscuring Ho's vision, but they were not opaque, not completely opaque, so he could still gaze upon the shadows, could still do just as the vermin prince had required him. And those shadows filled him with fear, with sadness and with regret, filled him with an overwhelming reluctance, a begrudging acceptance of what was to become, of what would be required of him. Because as he watched the shadows of the altar, they shifted and they turned. The altar was transformed, its filth transmogrified into something far, far more abhorrent, or perhaps not. Perhaps the altar, like an egg, like that detestable chrysalis, simply split open, giving birth to that hulking figure, spewing forth the destroyer. Ho began to shake his head, began to fight against his ropes, a hopeless attempt to free himself, to halt this horrible ritual, even though he knew he was far, far too late, because as he watched, the figure stepped boldly through those pink flames. He marched proudly with a king's bearing into Ho's vision, but before Ho could examine his bulky frame, his weathered skin, or even the madness burning into his single eye, the destroyer let out a cry, a screech of bottomless agony, the cry of one imprisoned for an eternity, for whom freedom has become just as terrifying as captivity. The howl was as excruciating to hear as it must have been to emit, forcing Ho to shut his eyes, clenching them shut, anything to drown out that horrible, wretched noise. And when the howling stopped, when Ho managed to tear his eyes back open, he saw that the spell had been broken, that the ritual had been completed, that the altar was gone, that the flames had been quelled, and that there, standing before him, was the destroyer in all his truculent glory. He stood there, breathing heavily, wielding a massive, worn, blackened club and a hideous, sardonic, rictus grin. Thanks for checking out this, the best episode of SKALD yet. I know that there's a lot of competition in the podcast space, but I also know that there's nothing else out there like SKALD. Help me continue to spread the good word of the only story that matters by writing a good review of the show on your podcasting platform of choice. If you write a good one, like Tet Money did on iTunes, I'll read it right here on the show. Now that I've listened to SKALD, I'm no longer content with crap. While I jest with my title, the sentiment is all too true. When compared to other audio storytelling podcasts, I can say with absolute certainty that SKALD is by far the best. The power and vigor with which this story is told is something you need to experience. Do yourself a favor and hit subscribe. You'll be transported, transformed, and transfixed by this brutal fantasy epic. Just don't be alarmed when you find that hours have passed and you hunger for just one more trip to that godless and terrifying border realm. Leaving iTunes reviews is super helpful and much, much appreciated. But the show also needs something else to keep going and growing. Your monetary support. By signing up at patreon.com/skald, by tossing a few bucks into the virtual hat each month, you help safeguard the future of the only story that matters. A show that can only continue with your support. Logan McConnell gets this and is extremely generous with his monthly contribution, earning him this shout out. Go follow him on Twitter at MANUKIRU. Again, that's MANUKIRU. And take his advice to go check out my pal Dominic Maschidi's podcast, Tales from the Tavern. Do a little digging, and you can even find episodes featuring me. It's a very different type of fantasy from SKALD, but I think you'll dig it. If you're looking for more information on me or any of my many projects, including SKALD, my wrestling talk show, Straight Shoot, my comics work on the upcoming G.I. Joe series from IDW, or anything else, head to AubreySitterson.com. And make sure to follow me on all social media, especially Tumblr, as I'm trying to be more active there. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on everything. Finally, my weekly recommendation. I'm not a big anime guy. The pacing and the oftentimes bad translations, they just don't do much for me. But there's a recent series that bucks that trend. One Punch Man. The first season is available on Hulu, and I cannot recommend it enough. It's a superhero story, but it's very weird, very funny. As the protagonist, because he's extremely powerful, he's nonetheless overtaken by an overwhelming sense of ennui. Check it out. One Punch Man on Hulu. You're gonna dig it. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.